Hello and welcome to American Friction, the best US politics podcast that you're listening to right now. Unless you're listening to two at the same time, which they might be. I'm Jacob Jarvis.
And I am Chris Jones.
You are.
America, and the world, to be fair, suffered the first 100 days of Donald Trump's second reign. If you hadn't already noticed, he's more unpopular than ever thanks to the almost uncountable number of strange policies and executive orders he's imposed, including a crackdown on free speech.
Protests have broken out across the US, and there's a lot more still to come. But how easy is it to stand up against this administration and actually make a difference?
Well, Ami Fields-Meyer was a senior policy advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris and recently co-wrote an article in The New Yorker titled, "So You Want to Be a Dissident? A Practical Guide to Courage in Trump's Age of Fear." And he joins us now on American Friction. Ami, how are you doing?
It's good to be with you guys. I want to say that I'm glad that you're deriving so much entertainment from our suffering here in the United States. I'm glad that someone's capitalizing on it. So I'm ready for the American Friction meme coin whenever you just alert me beforehand so that I know it's coming.
We were talking about this in our last episode with Nikki. I was saying I really need to try and do a rug pull.
Yeah, so it's on its way, Ami.
Yeah.
And you could be the first investor.
Yeah. And I won't do a rug pull.
No, we might though.
But I might.
Anyway, onto the pod. I'm going to start with a nice, easy question here, really, because it's fairly rare that we get someone who has actual real life White House experience, and you were working within the White House between 2021 and 2024. How did it go for you? What was it like in that period working in the White House?
It's unlike anything else. I mean, I'd worked in politics and government for about a decade. Leading up to that, I'd worked in state government and state politics in California, and then worked for the mayor of Los Angeles. I was a speechwriter. And so I'd sort of been in the policymaking process before, and I'd worked with elected officials and public officials. The White House is a different beast, and it feels heavy all the time. It feels consequential. And in another sort of strange way, it's also just a place you walk in to work every day. And so you have to find a way to stand in a balance between those two things. But it was a great honor to be there. And, the expectations were quite high. The level of rigor was quite high, but I was glad to be able to do it.
Did you find yourself looking to people with more experience to kind of shadow and pick up on? Do you kind of learn by just observing? And to draw that to the Trump White House, do you think it must be quite a strange place at the moment that the junior people are looking up to senior people who also don't have a fucking clue what's going on?
I would be fascinated to see what's going on. Remarkably, they have not yet asked me to join their team. I don't know. I'm not sure why. That's a bummer. Yeah, I mean, I think part of what strikes me as strange about this White House is obviously the number of leaks that we saw. We saw that in the first administration, and it sort of continued on into this administration. There was a sort of, let's say, an honor code or like a sort of amount of decorum. And there was a sense that we were all sort of in it together and a loyalty. Now, obviously, you don't want to allow that to impair your judgment if something truly nefarious is going on. But it does feel like, on the one hand, sort of just dispositionally, I always find it strange watching these people who feel very competitive with each other. To your question, is the level of sheer incompetence? I mean, this was the question. We could talk more about this. This was the question that this time around is, maybe now that they've done the Heritage Foundation thing, they've done the Project 2025 thing, are they going to be more organized? And it felt for a while like they weren't. And to some extent, they are more organized. They had executive orders and policy memos written 6 months ago, 12 months ago, that it feels like for a while they've just been playing out. But anytime they have to go off script, it does feel like a complete shit show. And so, yes, I do think that it must be strange. If you have any sense of what's, of expectations, it would be strange to be in a place right now where it feels like most of the time they're just winging it. I mean, you saw the story about Trump's adjustment of the tariff. They had to wait till one of his advisors was on the other side of the building, the Eisenhower Executive Office building. Two of his other advisors could try to grab him in the Oval Office. That's like, That's the kind of thing that didn't happen. As they say, that's the kind of thing that didn't happen in my old school.
Just one more question on kind of working within the White House. You mentioned you mentioned briefly impaired judgment, and I wonder how difficult it is to work within an administration, specifically working within the White House, and so closely to elected officials who have a high following. Everyone knows who these people are, and because of that, and because of the policies that are put forward, there's always going to be some kind of backlash or people talking against the policies that are put forward. As someone who's worked in the White House for quite a while, how hard is it to block out that noise and just get on with the job?
That's a great question. It can range. I mean, I guess I would say morale is, like in any office, morale is really important. And I think that on our most difficult days, I was not in the White House yet on the day of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but I have friends and colleagues who had already begun there. And the way that they talk about that day is that it became, even for people who weren't working on that particular issue, that it was an incredibly challenging thing for anybody to be part of or even peripheral to. It was challenging for the country. There's an argument that everything after that point for Biden was much more difficult because he had sort of lost the trust of lots of the country. But days like that are very, very difficult. And it's also difficult when there's sillier coverage and sort of more frivolous scandal. But the people who I've worked with in politics are better than most at tuning out the noise and deciding that we're trying to make progress on a particular issue. We have a sense. You have almost always gauged what that's going to look like and what it's going to feel like and how a policy is going to land. And you can adjust. The point of making good policy is to sort of make it a little hotter or make it a little colder. But people generally you grow a thick skin in politics.
You mentioned the word shit show earlier, so let's talk.
I meant that in only the
administration.
most technical sense.
We say it a lot as well. We are very technical people. Many predicted that this administration, before Trump had won any election, would be a revenge tour, taking on those who were challenging him in an illegal capacity. From how he's run his first 100 days or so, how right do you think those predictions were? And can you see that within the public polling of how unpopular that he is?
This is an interesting question, I think, from two different perspectives. One perspective is from the people who didn't vote for him, and then from the people who did vote for him. Let's talk for a second about the people who didn't vote for him and who didn't want him to be president. After he won in November and December and January, there were sort of two possible universes of what might happen in a new Trump presidency. One, let's call it universe A, was it would be bad. It would be a lot like the first administration. They would be going for a sort of greater cultural conservatism, and they would be trying to use the fact that they have the courts for greater victories. They would cut back the administrative state. Maybe Trump would keep some of his promises, but that fundamentally, even if the characters were a little bit more strange, and some of the guardrails, the people who had been holding him back, even if all of that remained, we were still fundamentally in the normal bounds of American political history. And that is, I think, an argument that people would make up until January 6th, really. But that, for the most part, the first Trump administration, while it had authoritarian tendencies, he was kneecapped and held back in many ways. Universe B was what ended up happening, which is that we aren't looking for a more conservative Washington. We're looking on, Trump is going to create Budapest on the Potomac, that we're looking at you have to start studying Patrick Deneen and start studying what Viktor Orban calls illiberal democracy, and that he's going to hollow out the administrative state, and that he's going to go after civil society actors, and that and fundamentally go after the core of a free society. And that is what happened. And so for a while, the people who had voted for him, who thought that maybe Universe B was going to happen, were holding out hope that maybe Universe A was going to happen, but it didn't. That is not where we are. From the perspective of the people who did vote for him, there's also something interesting going on, because a lot of people are disappointed in him. I saw a poll yesterday, back to the polling, if we are looking at the polling, that like 1 in 4 Trump voters is now disappointed or regrets voting for him or something. And these are real people. Like I have a friend who has a family business that has relied on government contractors for years. They're in Tennessee, and most of their people voted for Trump, and the well has dried up because he hollowed out the administrative state. There are no more government contracts in the stuff that they were doing. But this is true across the board for immigrants who didn't think that Trump meant them or their family. It's true for people who relied on public benefits. And I think that the thing that people forget most characterologically about this guy is that he's not actually very ideological. He's retributive, but he's not very ideological. He's a completely empty vessel being willing to get sold to the highest bidder. And there are factions of American politics who have understood this more than others over the years. The sort of Christian nationalist movement has always understood this about Trump. You remember 10 years ago when he'd started running for president and you saw this guy who like pays to sleep with porn stars and has had all these affairs and et cetera, now has this alliance with the religious right. But the religious right understands that he's a vessel. He's not an ideological guy. If he can enter into coalition. So all these people who in some ways I feel for, in other cases I don't, saying, wait, I didn't know that he meant me, or I didn't know that he would abandon me. I think that's despite all evidence to the contrary. I don't know who the constituency is at this point. Wall Street too. Wall Street can't believe it either, right? So I think the constituency is shrinking rapidly, and we'll see what happens after this.
Yeah, well, back to polling. If you look at the polling, it's all downhill really in terms of how popular he is, and that's even true amongst Republican voters. And if you look at independents as well, that's also going down in a lot of polling. But as you say, it's an interesting metric, and it's one that it gives you a parameter, but not always the full picture. But in terms of what you've seen, you mentioned everyday, normal Americans. In terms of what they're seeing, in your opinion, what has angered people the most? Do you think it's the way he's handled the economy, which he seems to have no idea what he's doing with tariffs, for example? Is it the way that he's gone after immigrants? Or is it, promoting someone like Elon Musk, an unelected bureaucrat, to such a high position? Or is it just a culmination of all of these terrible decisions coming together and also being so high profile in the news as well?
A lot of people in my world who are having a debate right now about what to focus on. And there are people who believe that because the economy was always such a strong polling issue for him, any wavering and any weakness is the place that we should be focusing all of our oppositional energy. Exploit that and leave everything else, all the human rights violations, all the anti-democratic stuff, leave that aside. And I understand that from a sort of electoral politics perspective. I think that there's a reason to focus on other stuff that's also angering people. So I was at something with Senator Chris Murphy the other day, who's the senator from Connecticut, who, if you've been following American politics, is sort of ascendant in the last 6 months or so. And I think he's a great spokesperson for the party and also just a really rational person. And he said there was all this debate during the election about whether Vice President Harris was focused too much on the democracy piece of the Trump threat. That, he's gonna be a fundamental threat to the norms of our American democracy, and that we just should have talked about the economy. And if we talked about anything, and Murphy's point after that was, look, you can make that argument on the margins, but at the end of the day, she was right. I mean, the truth is that he has gone after free society, he has gone after the institutions that undergird our democracy. And so it's hard to make the case that we shouldn't have talked about it then. It's also hard for me to think about making the case that we shouldn't be talking about it right now. Trump has become less popular on every metric. I mean, the economy is the most meaningful one, and where we're starting the sort of most precipitous decline as it relates to tariffs. But he's also become less popular on immigration as well, which nobody ever thought he could have.
Yeah.
There's one other piece here that I would add in terms of the thing you're asking. You're asking an atmospherics question, like what's the vibe? And I do think that vibe can be an incredibly exploitable and potent political force. If it feels like things are out of control, if it feels like Trump is doing things that are un-American, if it feels that Trump is doing things that are sort of undignified and mean-spirited, but also sort of fundamentally pushing back on our rights, like sending people without due process to foreign concentration camps. I do think that there's a strong argument for building out that case. I think that for the most part that people are decent and have a sense of what it means to be American, and that if we can make the case that the thing that these most egregious violations of human rights and democratic norms, like the one I just mentioned, are really out of step with what most Americans think. I actually think that that's an important place to be having a conversation.
With the free speech side of things, we've seen some of the pushback come around that and the way that he's clamped down on protests on campus and all that sort of thing. On the vibe of that, do you think that some of the people on the right, I always thought that Trump was free speech. That was his thing. And Joe Rogan, free speech, all these kind of big supporters of Trump, I thought that was their thing. And look, I'm not there to police every single thing that is said on university campuses. And I'm sure there've been some stuff said on university campuses that I don't agree with. But that doesn't mean they can just get blackbagged and shoved out of the country or draconian measures enacted upon them. Are some of the vibes within the free speech cohort, maybe the more libertarian side of voters who borrowed their vote to Trump, let's say, are they starting to notice that? Or are they just so aloof that they're like, well, we've got our free speech. We can say Nazi shit on Twitter if we want. But, fuck them people. We don't really care about their free speech. Are they starting to grasp that?
Did you see this Joe Rogan clip a couple of days ago?
No,
I listened to everything he puts out. I listened to all 3 hours. No, I'm just kidding. Would never.
Nice.
No, but
while you're doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu.
I'm exactly the demographic. Jewish guy from West LA. No, I think so. I saw this clip on Rogan that was going around. And I guess it was targeted to me because of my algorithm in particular. But he said exactly this the thing you just said, which is if we can do it when we're in power, they can do it when they're in power. Which I think is the only thing that's encouraging about that is the suggestion that maybe there might be another democratically held election in the United States. So that's a victory. But look, I'm not in that world. What I have seen is that there are increasing numbers. For example, I'm Jewish. The Jewish community in the United States is largely quite liberal. And on the issue of Israel, there is a range of diverse opinions. You have seen even some of the sort of traditional, more conservative American Jewish groups like the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, which had been suggesting investigations and other sanctions for student protesters. They seem to get that this is overreach. And there are a lot of people in sort of in those mainstream coalitions who seem to understand that this is overreach, even if they're not going all the way there. They don't want to piss off the president for various reasons. So I do think that people understand that if this can happen to anybody, it can happen to you if the roles were reversed. The thing that it's hard for me to factor in and to really suss out is whether that message can break through in a right-wing media environment, sort of a closed ecosystem. And that I think remains to be seen.
You wrote about people who want to push back. You wrote that people who never aspired to be activists but oppose the new order are finding that they must traverse a labyrinth of novel choices, calculations, and personal risks. How do you think Trump has made it so difficult to stand up to his administration? I mean, we obviously talk about the high level, the deportations and stuff like that, and we've seen the videos of people being stopped in the streets by plainclothes officers and that sort of thing. But are there more maybe bureaucratic things he's done? Are there more sort of low level stuff that is not so visually horrific, but nonetheless quite insidious for people who want to push back?
Thanks for asking your question. I'm going to answer a different question that I want to answer.
Yeah, that's fine. Political run in the future.
I think it's less about it. The question is less whether he has done things that feel more insidious the real implications here are about the way that the climate of fear and retribution is manifesting for more ordinary people. So, for example,
Okay.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was threatened by Tom Homan, the immigration border czar, sort of cartoonish border czar guy, when she started hosting Know Your Rights trainings for immigrants in her district. They said, maybe DOJ is going to investigate her. It was easy for her as a well-known progressive activist, maybe the leading, beyond Bernie Sanders, the leading progressive in the United States, to stand up and say, I'm not afraid of you. It is a lot harder for the young lawyer in one of these law firms that's being pushed into a deal with the federal government, or just ordinary person, a member of your community, to show up for an ICE Watch training to try to support immigrants who are living in this climate of fear. People are fearful for their jobs. People are fearful for their way of life. People have, even if it's not a one-to-one, it just seems a lot riskier right now than it has in a really, really long time. We have had in the United States intense periods in which the government has weaponized fear against its people. That happened after World War II, when President Truman tried to purge all the alleged communists and Soviet sympathizers from the federal government, and that created a lot of paranoia and fear, and stifled people. Obviously, it happened during the civil rights movement, and has happened over long periods of time to Black activists in the United States, when J. Edgar Hoover would send people to spy on and intimidate, and sometimes actually harass individual sort of dissident leaders. It happened after 9/11, in the years after 9/11, to Muslim and Arab American communities, where there were plainclothes agents who were surveilling these communities. So this has happened, and it happens frequently. But the sort of massive level of universal fear is what seems new, at least to this generation of Americans. And I think that if you are any given person, and we could say more about this in a second, but I think that if you're any given person who's trying to withdraw your support or help your sector of society or your institution withdraw its support from this administration, which is critically important, it's not that that there are necessarily specific things, but that everybody is a little bit less likely to take a risk, and risk is a vector for political pushback and change. And if people and individuals are less likely to take risks, then so are institutions, and we're more likely to have this democratic backslide.
There have been some protests, though. We've seen a lot, specifically from 5051, for example, right across the country. There have also been protests against Tesla, which we've seen have enormous impact on their stocks, and their share prices basically just dropping off a cliff. How successful do you think that these kinds of protests that we have seen physically manifest have been so far?
One thing that was surprising to me when we were reporting this piece for The New Yorker, when we talked to dissidents all over the world, but we also talked to scholars, domestic scholars of nonviolent resistance, civil resistance in the United States. And there's a group out of Harvard and maybe the University of Connecticut, although I might be getting that wrong, called the Crowd Counting Consortium. And they are counting, they have a methodology for counting how many protests are happening in the United States at any given time. And I think it has felt to people, or at least it did until recently, that we weren't seeing the sort of level of people in the streets that we saw. People remember the massive 4 million people in the streets all across the country, women's marches from the beginning of the first Trump administration, and other such protests. And what we found is that what they have found, we're actually seeing at least 3 times as many protests in the United States right now as that period of the first Trump administration. And so people are activated. It's just happening in different kinds of ways. It's happening at, you say, Tesla stations, but and sorts of other things. The question, as you ask, is how effective is that? And maybe we should just define the terms of what effective is. I would just say Donald Trump is at the very least, an American president with authoritarian impulses. And how much history remembers him as an authoritarian or as an autocrat will depend on how successful he is at consolidating power and doing the things that are consistent with an autocracy or with an authoritarian state. But he's certainly a person with authoritarian impulses. And so part of the question that we asked activists all over the world and scholars over the world is, what have been the most successful at this stage of what we call now competitive authoritarianism, which is a term coined by Steve Levitsky and others at Harvard, which means it seems like we're in a period where we're going to keep the trappings of democracy, like elections and a Congress and free media, but that those innovations those features of American society, of American democracy, are going to become weaker in form and in power. So there's an argument that what we're going through in the United States right now is what the scholar Steve Levitsky refers to as competitive authoritarianism, which is in part what Hungary and other places are beginning to see, which is we continue to have the trappings of democracy. We have elections, free elections, sort of, and we have a free media, and we have courts, and we have a Congress that meets regularly, and those things aren't disbanded, but they cease to have as much meaning as they have had in the past. So the people who study this have found that one or two protests is not that helpful, but long-term, consistent organizing that builds pressure over time and that becomes more powerful as it goes and can withdraw support from individual pieces of society, like business withdrawing its support or religious institutions withdrawing their support. Those kinds of protests are much more effective than the sort of one-time thing that we've seen up until this point. And so I think that's the direction that we're hoping to see the United States continue to take.
Just on a question on the effectiveness of protests here, and a word here that, if there's any Joe Rogan listeners listening in, they'll think I'm pretty woke for saying.
Are you worried about that?
Well, I think we've probably got a big base of them, but sort of the solidarity aspect, but like not using that as just a buzzword, I suppose, but on the effectiveness of protests. Is there something to look at that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to look? It's going to be hard over the next few years to stop Trump doing very much of what he wants, but is the benefit of protests that it will help maintain and retain communities, which whenever we come out of the other side of this, will be better prepared for rebuilding and keeping some integrity of the things we can control? Because you can't really control the legislation in many ways. There'll be votes, there'll be midterms, which will take some power from Trump. But is that maybe one of the important things, as you say, of seeing these on a kind of low humming level but widespread is a good thing, because it just holds people together? And maybe that's one of the few things we can actually hope for, is that people give a shit about their neighbors, and when they're through this, they'll have them neighbors to rebuild with.
What we found in our reporting is that when you are in an authoritarian situation or in a backsliding situation, like the kind of thing that the United States is going through right now, that, as I said, risk and willing to take risk at your job, in politics, going to the streets, or being willing to do any number of other forms of withdrawing support from a regime, speaking up at your law firm, in the context of the United States. One of the most difficult things about that kind of risk taking is the loneliness that comes with it, the sort of psychological toll that comes from it, and the sense that you're doing it on your own. A lot of the dissidents that we spoke to in Nicaragua and Venezuela, we talked to folks from Russia and Hungary and other parts of the world, described that they had assumed that when they took a first step that other people would join them. And there were times when that happened, but there were other times when it didn't happen. And what everyone describes to a person is that the thing that sustained their activism during long periods of political instability, and even when they were being targeted for arrest or targeted for other forms of political retribution, was having a community of people. And so you're talking about this. It's funny, like people talk about finding your people, finding community as some sort of a woke thing, but it's actually, it's obviously a spiritual thing and it's a sort of metaphysical thing. But I think it's also what we would find is that it's just an important survival mechanism to be able to exist in a tribe of people. We talked to this didn't make it into the story, but we talked to a Russian dissident who is no longer there. She's a scholar, a legal scholar. And she said that one thing that she found to be helpful was what she and others, there was a Russian word for it called internal exile, which is that you just hang out with people who you don't have questions about what their values are, and you don't have questions for this period of time, in which we are fighting for our political survival. You find people who you can just be in community with. Fundamentally, you don't have to think through these survival questions. She also used a word called non-handshakability, which is also a very Russian word. Non-handshakability, which is like if there are people who you don't think that you could sort of shake hands with that. I mean, she meant it in a literal sense, but and still trusted that you were going to be okay, that you should do that there too. So there is, I think, a sort of this is not the only step that we suggest in terms of drawing on political courage and taking on a dissident posture in the United States, but community has practical and strategic implications beyond the wokeness that you are so earnestly concerned about.
I don't want anyone to think I'm woke.
No, I already do, but
no, I've been getting that vibe, man, if I'm being honest with
you. Final question, Ami, and it's one I like to ask people sometimes because it makes them squirm, and I think that's fun. Congress, do you fancy running for it?
Oh, you ask people this?
Sometimes.
Yeah. You ask everybody this?
Not everyone, but I'm asking you right now.
Never say never. Never say never.
Interesting. That's the first time someone hasn't skirted around it.
Yeah, fair
Well,
enough.
actually, no.
Yeah.
He kind of did.
You've been completely duped.
What am I on about?
There's somebody who just said, yes, I'm running for Congress soon. And vote for me.
Yeah, run for Congress, man, because if Chris can be that duped,
I've been fooled.
Then I think you'll be very successful. Ami, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure.
All of you back at home, thank you very much for listening into the show as well. Listeners, remember, in the year we've been doing this podcast, the landscape of American politics has changed pretty dramatically.
Oh, has it?
And yeah, it really has.
Oh, I hadn't noticed.
People thought Kamala Harris was going to win. I'm sorry, Ami. But, we want to keep covering the stories that mean the most and speaking to the people with the most to say about what is going on and important things about what is going on. So we do need your support in order to keep doing that. Listening really does support us. You're part of our community. But there is also an extra way you can do it, and that would be by backing us on Patreon. If you search American Friction Podcast Patreon or go to patreon.com/American Friction, you can sign up. There's the link in the show notes. You'll get bonus content. We have a community chat, and well, we just really need you to do it so we can keep going. So that's the main thing. Quick reminder, if you can't support us financially, we get that. But if you enjoy what we're doing, please do go rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening to the show. You've been listening to American Friction. I've been, and I am, Jacob Jarvis. Thank you for listening to the show.